From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
The Justice Department sues Texas over a floating barrier in the Rio Grande as the Teamsters and UPS cut a deal to avoid an impending strike that could have harmed the economy. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Bill McGurn. On Monday, the Justice Department sued the state of Texas over the installation of a floating barrier in the Rio Grande River meant to stop people from crossing into Texas from Mexico. Let's start with a clip of Texas Governor Greg Abbott on Fox News on Monday, explaining what this floating barrier does and why he doesn't think it's a violation of the law.
These devices have turned away and repelled tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people who try to enter into the United States illegally. It is in the public interest for the state of Texas to be safeguarding and securing our border from people entering the United States illegally. For another, we believe that statute does not apply in any way because what the state of Texas is doing through those buoys is not in violation of that statute.
Monet, what do you make of this argument, and who's got the better legal end of it?
Well, it's an interesting question because we just heard Greg Abbott, the governor of Texas, make an argument for the barriers on the merits, saying that they're a deterrent to illegal migrants crossing the border, and also make an argument for the barriers on the legal merits, basically saying that they aren't a violation of federal immigration law. And I think his first argument is quite strong and his second one is pretty weak. So in terms of the actual practical effect of these barriers, which again are a chain of large buoys that the state of Texas erected in the Rio Grande near Eagle Pass, Texas, about 1,000 feet long. It does seem as if they are having some deterrent effect, at least on migrants who would have chosen to cross at that point. It is quite common for migrants to try to cross the Rio Grande River at its shallower portions, either by floating or by swimming. And these barriers were placed at a section of the river where it was quite common to cross and where border officers had to patrol actively and try to deter people from trying to cross. And so it does seem likely that the barriers have made it much more difficult to do that for people who would have chosen to cross there. Greg Abbott might have been a little optimistic on the number that it had dissuaded, but I think that anyone would agree that they had some impact, and it was the intention of Texas to place more of these types of buoy barriers to prevent river crossings, which also are quite dangerous. I think it's important to add that it's common for migrants to drown actually accidentally when they're trying to make these crossings. And so it is worthwhile for the state of Texas to try to discourage people from crossing in this way. But we also heard Greg Abbott argue that the barriers are legal and in no way violate federal immigration laws and border policy, and that does not seem to be true. So the statute that the Justice Department cited in its lawsuit against Texas is from the Rivers and Harbors Act and basically suggests that no actor can place any kind of temporary or permanent barrier in federal waters, which of course a border river like the Rio Grande would be, without specific permission from the Army Corps of Engineers, which Greg Abbott did not seek and did not receive. And so this doesn't actually seem to be a particularly ambiguous case in terms of the legal merits. It's very likely, I think, that the Justice Department is going to prevail in its lawsuit and force Greg Abbott to remove those barriers because he didn't abide by the letter of the law, despite the fact that his intentions were good in trying to dissuade illegal border crossings.
Meantime, a federal judge in California, John Tiger, has blocked a rule from the Biden administration restricting whether you can get asylum if you cross in between points of entry. Here's a piece of the judge's ruling. The court concludes that the rule is contrary to law because it presumes ineligible for asylum non-citizens who enter between ports of entry using a manner of entry that Congress expressly intended should not affect access to asylum. And so, Bill, in both of these cases, it seems to me, we have more examples of how immigration laws of this country are a problem and are broken, and the ball is in Congress's court because states are trying to do things to prevent these illegal crossings. The federal government, the White House, the president is trying to do things to cut down on these illegal crossings. And we are finding time and again, as happened in the Biden administration, as happened in the Trump administration, as happened before that, that federal judges are striking down those things as contrary to the law. And so The question, I think, goes back to Congress.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Kyle. And that's what most people have missed about this. There's a lot of criticism of specific policies, from both the people that want to restrict immigration and the leaders of sanctuary cities. Eric Adams and other Democratic mayors are complaining about the White House not giving them support for the migrants that ended up there for housing and food and so forth. And governors like Greg Abbott are complaining that they're being overrun and the federal government isn't doing anything. But as you point out, it's really up to Congress. All the things that we put in place under Trump, for example, using COVID policy to keep them out. It might have been effective in stopping it, but it's a Band-Aid. It's no substitute for an immigration policy. The same thing with this federal judge opposing the Biden administration's efforts to have immigration in a more orderly way. I'm not sure the judge was right, but I think it gets back to what you say. Congress has to really come up with the system, and it's abdicated. I was in the White House with Bush when he reached a deal with some of the senators that, wasn't perfect, but made a stab at having a rational immigration policy. And among the people that killed it was Barack Obama with these poison pill provisions. Even Kennedy was on board. So until Congress comes up with a real solution and laws that our immigration authorities can obey, we're going to have this hodgepodge of Band-Aid measures that our federal judges will find inadequate. I think they have to do it. And I think for Congress to act, really, the president needs to act. He needs to put forward a policy and have provisions that would appeal to the other side. We have to have a bipartisan immigration compromise. Doesn't mean you have to agree with every part, but you have to make it better. And I think, unfortunately, some people would rather have it get worse than accommodate and have a solution that goes 3/4 of the way.
It does put the White House in a pickle, though, because they are judged by their success at controlling the border flows with their hands tied behind their back by the laws passed by Congress. So you've seen some Democrats in recent weeks celebrating that the border flows seem to be down. Here's the top of a Politico story, July 18th. Illegal border crossings plunged in June to their lowest level since President Joe Biden's first full month in office. I've seen some Republicans, Monet, suggesting that they don't expect that to last once this heat wave ends and the temperatures cool down there along the southern border. And then you also have to keep in mind that the White House had credited these restrictions on claiming asylum if you cross illegally between points of entry. And that's what this federal judge is now putting on hold. And according to some of the reporting, his ruling is not going to take effect for a couple weeks. Maybe it will be appealed by the White House, but that's another factor that could change those figures. And to Bill's point, though, why is President Biden not addressing that in the middle of a presidential campaign by coming out and saying, these are the changes to the immigration laws that we need to make to fix this problem, going to his allies in Congress, getting that passed through a Democratic Senate, and then you can go to the American people in 2024 and say, I got that job done.
Well, it's an interesting question. I think that what is undeniable is that illegal border crossings have dropped over the past couple of months. We've seen Border Patrol encountering many fewer illegal migrants than they had in the spring when we saw record numbers of crossings in anticipation of the end of Title 42, the previous main border enforcement policy. But it's always an interesting question when you see the numbers start to drop, because there are a whole lot of policies and a whole lot of factors involved, and it's very difficult to know which one is having the strongest effect. So like you said, the heat is almost definitely a factor. We're seeing record heat this summer. I think that people who are not in the Southwest might not be aware of quite how hot it has been for such a long period of time. We've seen temperatures around 100 105 or 110. That would make it very perilous, even from people who come from the hot parts of Central America, to try to make that crossing and be outdoors for several days. So that definitely has been a factor, and we can expect that not to last as the summer goes on and the temperatures come down eventually. But I think it's very likely that the Biden administration's policies have had an effect as well. As you and Bill have been discussing, after the lifting of Title 42, they did require migrants seeking asylum to present themselves at ports of entry as opposed to just crossing wherever they found most convenient. And they also required migrants to seek asylum in any third country that they might pass to en route to the United States. And so this basically made it so that people coming to the border were coming in a more orderly fashion, and people who failed to do that were being turned around. The federal judge in California ruled that these two restrictions on asylum claims violated the Immigration and Nationality Act. But I do think it's very likely that President Biden will be successful in appealing that ruling, because federal immigration law tends to give the president quite a lot of leeway in terms of how the laws are applied. And reasonable restrictions on how migrants can seek asylum generally have been permitted. And so we'll see within the next few weeks exactly how this progresses in the court of law. But it's very likely, I think, that those powers will be restored. And then on your last point about why President Biden doesn't just take this out of the court's hands by asking Congress to make explicit these new restrictions, the reason is because a lot of people in his own party oppose those types of restrictions. And even though he knows the government needs them on the merits, he doesn't want to have to force the progressive wing of the Democratic Party to either vote in favor of these restrictions in a way that's going to anger their supporters, or to vote against them in a way that is going to make Democrats look bad and weak on border enforcement. So he would rather have the Department of Homeland Security imposing these policies in a way that's going to attract much less news, rather than having to place them in the center of political news by forcing members of his party to take a vote on them.